My name is Madison Hayes. I am 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, I walked into a coffee shop on my lunch break and saw something that made my whole body go cold. My mother was sitting at a corner table with a man I had never seen in my life. She was leaning in close, smiling at him the way she only ever smiles at people she truly loves, and his hand was resting over hers on the table. I stood there frozen in the doorway, and without thinking, I pulled out my phone and started recording. Then I sent the video to my father. What happened in the next 2 hours changed everything I thought I knew about my family. But let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. My husband Jake and I had been going through a rough patch for a while. Not a dramatic, explosive kind of rough patch, the quiet kind. The kind that sneaks up on you slowly until one day you realize you can't remember the last time you actually talked to each other about something that mattered. We were both working too much, sleeping too little, and filling the silences between us with noise instead of conversation. It had been like that for almost 8 months, and I kept telling myself it was just a season. That we were just tired. That things would naturally fix themselves if we gave it enough time. My mother was the person I always called when I needed perspective. She had this gift for cutting through the noise and saying the exact right thing. She and my father had been married for 34 years, and even now they still made each other laugh the way people do in the first year of a relationship. Growing up, I used to watch them in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, my father stealing bites of whatever she was cooking, my mother pretending to be annoyed but smiling the whole time. They were the reason I believed in marriage. They were the reason I said yes when Jake asked me. So when things got hard between Jake and me, I leaned on my mom. She would listen patiently, ask the right questions, and always circle back to the same thing: show up for each other. Keep showing up even when it's hard. That was her philosophy, and she lived it. Which is why what I saw in that coffee shop made absolutely no sense to me. It was a Tuesday. I only had 40 minutes for lunch, and I had stopped at Briar and Bloom, the coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital where I work. I went there at least 3 times a week and knew the layout well enough to navigate it half asleep. I pushed open the door, the bell above it chiming softly, and I was already looking at my phone, scrolling through messages, when something made me glance up toward the back corner of the room. My mother was sitting there. That alone surprised me because she lived 20 minutes away and had never once mentioned this place. But the surprise of seeing her was immediately swallowed by something much heavier because she wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man I had never seen before. He looked to be in his late 50s, silver-haired, wearing a dark blue button-down. He was leaning slightly forward with his elbows on the table, and my mother was looking at him with an expression I can only describe as relief. Like she had been holding her breath for a very long time and had finally been allowed to exhale. I told myself I was reading into it. I told myself I was probably just tired and projecting, and that this was obviously just a friend or a colleague or someone completely ordinary. But then he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. And she didn't pull away. She closed her eyes for just a second, and a small smile crossed her face, and something about that smile felt deeply private. Like I wasn't supposed to see it. I stepped backward through the door before she could look up. My heart was already beating faster than it should have been. I stood outside on the sidewalk for a moment, telling myself I was overreacting. My mother was one of the most trustworthy people I had ever known. She was steady and principled and devoted to my father in a way that never seemed like performance. It was just who she was. But the hand, the smile, the way she closed her eyes. I went back to the edge of the doorway, keeping myself half hidden behind the doorframe, and I opened my camera. My hands weren't shaking yet, but they felt strange, like they didn't quite belong to me. I recorded for about 20 seconds. My mother laughing softly at something the man said, him shaking his head and smiling back at her. Their hands still touching on the table. Then she reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and the gesture looked almost young. Like a younger version of herself had surfaced for a moment. I stopped the recording and looked at what I had captured. Even watching it back immediately, it looked exactly as bad as I feared. I sent it to my father without adding any message. The moment I pressed send, I felt something shift in my chest. I wasn't sure if I had just done the right thing or the worst thing I had ever done in my life. He called me back in under a minute. His voice was careful when he said my name. I told him I was outside the coffee shop right now, that I hadn't gone in, that I didn't know what I was looking at, and that I really, really hoped it was nothing. He went quiet for a few seconds, and that silence was its own kind of answer. Then he said he was on his way. He asked me to wait outside and not go in yet. I stood on that sidewalk for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the time on my phone the entire time, checking it obsessively the way you do when you're hoping that enough minutes passing will somehow resolve something that has nothing to do with time. When my father's car pulled up, I felt a rush of relief that lasted about 3 seconds. Then I looked at his face through the windshield as he got out, and the relief evaporated. He looked pale, not angry, which I had expected. Just pale and very still, the way people look when they've been carrying something heavy for a while and don't know yet whether they're about to put it down or drop it. He hugged me briefly, which surprised me. Then he pulled back and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not quite fear. Something more complicated. "Is she still in there?" he asked. I nodded. He straightened his jacket. "Okay," he said quietly. "Come in with me." We pushed open the door together. The bell chimed. The smell of espresso and warm wood filled the room, and it felt wrong that a place could smell this ordinary in a moment like this. I scanned the room instinctively, and my mother was still there in the corner, still sitting across from the same man, though now they both had cups in front of them and she appeared to be talking, animated, like she was telling him a story. She didn't see us come in. Not immediately. My father walked ahead of me, and I followed a few steps behind. My stomach had turned into a hard knot. I kept my eyes on my mother's face, waiting for the moment she would look up, bracing myself for whatever expression would appear when she did. It happened when we were about 10 feet away. She glanced up mid-sentence, the way people do when they register movement in their peripheral vision, and the moment she saw my father, her entire face changed. The animation drained out of it. Not guilt, exactly. Something more layered. Something I didn't have a word for yet. She stood up from her chair. "Robert," she said. Just his name. Her voice was barely above a normal volume, but the way she said it made the two people at the nearest table look over. My father stopped a few feet from the table. He looked at her. He looked at the man sitting across from her, who had now turned in his seat and was watching my father with an expression that was careful and braced, like someone waiting for a wave they knew was coming. The silence stretched for what felt like a full minute. Then my mother said, "I was going to tell you tonight. I swear to you, I was going to tell you tonight." My father's jaw tightened. "Tell me what, Karen?" She looked at the man at the table, and something passed between them. Then she looked back at my father, and her eyes were already filling. "This is Daniel," she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the name. "He's my brother." I heard the words. I understood them individually, but my brain refused to assemble them into something that made sense because my mother was an only child. I had been told that my entire life. My mother had no siblings. Her parents had passed away years ago. She had no living family except for us. My father didn't speak. I could see the muscles in his face working, processing. "You don't have a brother," I said. It came out before I could stop it. My mother turned to look at me, and the expression on her face broke something in me. She looked exhausted in the deepest possible way. "Not from today. From years." "I do," she said softly. "I always have. I just didn't know it until 4 months ago." She gestured toward the empty chairs. My father sat down slowly, like his body was making the decision without his full cooperation. I pulled out the chair beside him. The man across from us, Daniel, looked at both of us with quiet, measured eyes. He was older than my mother by a few years, I guessed. There was something around his eyes that reminded me faintly of her. I hadn't seen it before, but now that I was sitting close and looking directly at him, it was there. The same particular shape of the brow. The same way he held his mouth when he wasn't speaking. My mother wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and took a slow breath. She told us that when she was a baby, not even 2 years old, her parents had separated. Her father had left when she was very young, and what she had always been told was that he simply walked away from the family and never looked back. What she had never been told, what had been kept from her entire life by her mother and then carried to the grave, was that her father had another child from a previous relationship. A son, 7 years older than my mother. A boy named Daniel, who had grown up in a different state with a different family and who, for all of his adult life, had believed he was alone in the world too. Daniel had started searching first. He had used one of those DNA ancestry services about a year ago, mostly out of curiosity, mostly because he had never had a family that felt solid underneath him and he wanted to know where he came from. My mother had uploaded her own DNA profile 2 years earlier for the same reason, hoping to fill in the blank spaces in her history. The service had matched them as half-siblings. Daniel had sent her a message through the platform in early spring. My mother had not told anyone. Not my father. Not me. She had spent 4 months verifying everything, she said. Reading the message 100 times. Researching, cross-referencing, convincing herself it was real and then convincing herself again that she was wrong and then researching more. She had written Daniel back cautiously and they had exchanged emails for weeks before she agreed to a video call. Then another video call. Then a phone call that lasted 3 hours on a Thursday night while my father thought she was on a work call in the bedroom. She apologized for that specifically. She looked at my father when she said it. He nodded once, slowly. She explained that she kept waiting for the right moment to bring it up. She wanted to be certain first. She wanted to understand what this was before she tried to explain it to anyone else. And then certain became more certain, and she still didn't say anything, and she knows now that the longer she waited, the harder it became. They had met in person for the first time today. That was the first time. This coffee shop meeting, the one I had stumbled into and recorded and sent to my father in a panic, was their first time ever sitting in the same room together. Daniel spoke for the first time since we had sat down. His voice was low and measured. He said that he understood how this looked from the outside and that he was sorry for any pain his presence had caused. He said he had not wanted to disrupt anyone's life. He had only wanted to find out if he had family somewhere in the world. There was a moment of silence after he said that. A long one. And then my father did something I wasn't expecting. He reached across the table and extended his hand to Daniel. Daniel looked at the hand. Then he reached out and shook it. 34 years, my father said quietly. 34 years, and she still surprises me. It wasn't quite a joke, but it wasn't quite not a joke either, and my mother laughed through what were now very obvious tears, and the sound of that laugh in the middle of all the tension was like a window opening in a room that had been closed too long. I sat there and I didn't say anything for a while because I was trying to locate exactly what I was feeling and I couldn't. There was relief, enormous relief, and underneath it there was embarrassment for having panicked and sent that video, and underneath it there was something more complicated. A question I couldn't quite shape yet. I asked it eventually. I asked my mother why. Not why she had done it, I understood that part. But why she felt she had to hide it alone. Why she had sat with something this significant for 4 months without letting a single person in. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something I have thought about nearly every day since. She said she had spent her whole life being told that she had no family left. That after her mother passed, that was it. That was the end of the line, and some part of her had internalized that as a permanent fact about herself. And when Daniel's message arrived, it terrified her as much as it moved her. Because what if she told everyone and then it turned out to be wrong? What if she got it wrong? She said she couldn't bear the idea of handing everyone a piece of hope and then taking it back. So she held onto it herself, alone, until she was absolutely sure it was real. She reached across the table and took my father's hand. "I was going to tell you tonight," she said again. "We were coming to dinner. Both of us. I had it all planned." My father turned her hand over in his and looked at it. "You could have told me the minute you got that first message," he said. "I know," she said. "I would have sat up all night reading it with you." "I know that too," she said. Her voice was very quiet. He shook his head slowly. Not in anger, just in that particular kind of sadness that comes from knowing someone deeply enough to understand exactly what went wrong and why. "You've been carrying this alone for 4 months," he said. She nodded. He squeezed her hand once. "You don't have to do that. You've never had to do that." She leaned her forehead against his shoulder for a moment, and he put his arm around her, and neither of them said anything. I looked at Daniel. He was watching my parents with an expression that was impossible to read, though I thought I could see something in it that might have been longing. The particular longing of someone who has watched other people have something for a long time and wonders what that feels like from the inside. I introduced myself properly. I told him my name and that I was her daughter. He smiled and said he knew. He said my mother had shown him photographs. That detail hit me unexpectedly hard. The idea of my mother sitting with this stranger and showing him pictures of me, building a bridge between her new world and her old one, slowly and quietly, all by herself. We stayed in that coffee shop for almost 2 more hours. My lunch break became a full afternoon because I texted the floor supervisor and said it was a family situation, which was more true in that moment than it had ever been before. Jake came and met us around 3 o'clock because I had called him and tried to explain what was happening and realized halfway through the explanation that I was crying without noticing. He walked in, found our table, took in the scene, and sat down next to me without saying a word. He put his hand on my back and kept it there. It was such a simple thing and it undid me completely. I hadn't realized how much I missed that. How much I missed him reaching for me in quiet moments without being asked. Daniel told us about his life. He had grown up in Ohio, had spent 20 years as a high school history teacher before retiring early. Had never married, though he came close once and still speaks about her with a kind of fond, uncomplicated sadness that suggested the story ended well enough for both of them. He had 2 dogs. He drove a truck that was older than most of my friendships. He said he liked early mornings and long drives and old bookstores, and my mother laughed and said those were exactly the kinds of things their father had apparently loved too, based on what little she had learned. She had learned a few things about their father. Not everything, not enough. He had passed away 11 years ago in a small town in Colorado, and there wasn't much left behind except for fragments. A name, a date, a few records. But fragments, my mother said, were more than she'd had before, and right now fragments felt like enough. By the time we finally stood up to leave, the coffee shop had turned over its afternoon crowd and the evening regulars were starting to filter in. The barista behind the counter, a young woman with paint-stained fingers, gave us a curious look as we gathered our things. I wondered what we looked like from the outside. 5 people around a table with very red eyes and very empty coffee cups and the unmistakable residue of something significant having just happened. We walked out together into the late afternoon, the light coming in low and golden the way it does in October, and my father put his arm around my mother on the sidewalk. Daniel stood a few feet away, and there was a moment of awkward hovering where nobody was quite sure what the goodbye looked like. Then my mother stepped forward and hugged him. It was a long hug. The kind of hug that has years in it. He held on just as long as she did. When they separated, his eyes were bright, and he looked away quickly and cleared his throat and said something about traffic. My mother laughed and wiped her face with the back of her hand. We made plans for dinner the following Saturday. All of us. Daniel would drive down, and we would cook at my parents' house, and my mother said she was going to make her pot roast, and my father said that meant Daniel was already getting better treatment than most people got on their first visit, and Daniel smiled at that with his whole face. After he drove away, we stood in the parking lot for a few more minutes. Jake was beside me, and I was still holding his hand from when he had taken mine as we walked out. I realized I hadn't let go. My mother looked at me with an expression that was part apology and part something else. "I'm sorry you found out like this," she said. I shook my head. "I'm sorry I sent Dad that video before I even went in to ask you what was happening." She gave me a look that was too wise and too tired to be described as anything other than motherly. "You were scared," she said. "When we're scared, we act fast. Sometimes too fast." I thought about the 11 minutes I had spent on that sidewalk. About my finger hovering over the send button. about how certain I had been in that moment that I knew what I was looking at. I was so sure, I said. I know, she said. I looked guilty. I know I looked guilty. She paused. Hiding something good can look just like hiding something bad. From the outside, that sentence sat with me for the rest of the night. On the drive home, Jake and I were quiet for a while, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one we had been living in for the past 8 months. Not the blank, avoidant quiet. Something more like the quiet after a long exhale. He spoke first. He said that watching my father walk into that coffee shop, not knowing what he was walking into, and still reaching out to shake Daniel's hand the way he did, had affected him in a way he wasn't entirely sure how to articulate. I told him I knew what he meant. He said he had been thinking a lot about showing up, about how he used to be better at it, and how somewhere along the way he had let busyness become an excuse, and he was tired of doing that. I said I was tired of it too. He reached over and found my hand on the center console. He held it the rest of the way home. It was such a small thing. The smallest thing. And it felt like every mile we drove, something we had let go cold was warming back up. We stayed up until 1 in the morning talking. Not about anything urgent. Not about schedules or finances or logistics. Just about things we had stopped telling each other. Memories, fears. Small private thoughts that had nowhere to go when you stopped making space for them. At some point, we ended up sitting on the kitchen floor with mugs of tea because the kitchen chairs seemed too formal for the conversation we were having. And we stayed there until the tea was cold and neither of us could stop yawning. Before we went to sleep, I texted my mother. I told her I loved her and that I couldn't wait for Saturday dinner. She wrote back 3 words. He likes pot roast. I laughed for a full minute. Then I put my phone down and went to sleep easier than I had in months. I have thought about that Tuesday often since it happened. About how fast a story can look like something it isn't. About how many times in my life I have been absolutely certain I understood what I was seeing and been wrong in ways that mattered. About my mother sitting with that DNA match for 4 months, turning it over alone in the quiet, protecting everyone from hope until she was sure it was real. There is something in that I understand now that I didn't understand before. The weight of protecting people from things that might hurt them. The cost of carrying that alone. The gift it is when someone says, "You can put that down, I'll hold it with you." That's what my father said to her, in his way, when he squeezed her hand in the coffee shop. You don't have to do that. You've never had to do that. I think about Jake reaching across the center console. The simplest gesture. The whole weight of showing up condensed into something that small. The Saturday dinner happened. Daniel arrived with a bottle of wine and a slightly overwhelming amount of anxiety that he covered with very dry humor, which my father matched perfectly. And by the time the pot roast was on the table, they were already telling each other stories like they had been doing it for years. My mother sat at the head of the table and watched all of us, and I have never in my life seen her look more at peace. After dessert, she reached into the kitchen drawer and pulled out a photograph. Old and slightly faded, the kind that comes from a film camera from decades past. A man standing on a porch with the sun behind him, squinting into the camera, smiling in a way that was only partial and a little shy. She set it on the table between her and Daniel without saying anything. Daniel went very still. He picked it up carefully, holding it by the edges. He looked at it for a long time. "That's him," my mother said softly. He nodded. He kept looking at the photograph. Then he turned it over, and someone had written a date on the back in faded ink. 1974. He set it down gently and pushed it back toward the center of the table, between them. Like it belonged to both of them equally, like that was the right place for it to live. I don't think I understood until that moment what it actually means to find something you didn't know was missing. Not just to find it, but to recognize it. To sit across from a stranger and see something familiar in the architecture of their face and know, somewhere beneath language, that the distance between you was never permanent. It was only time. And time, unlike so many other things, can be made up for. Slowly, imperfectly, over pot roast on a Saturday, one honest conversation at a time. We cleared the table together. All 5 of us. It was the most ordinary thing in the world.